Good morning to everybody. And we're starting our traditional seminar of the United for Ukraine Network. My name is Kobilius. I am chairing or leading that network. I'm from Lithuania, now member of European Parliament. And today we have really very important, very interesting seminar with a group of very prominent experts. And we shall discuss the topic which is really very important for the developments which are happening on EU sanctions towards Russia. And the topic is EU sanctions on Russian fossil fuels, strengthening enforcement and closing loopholes. We shall devote our attention both to oil and gas issues on the price cap and things like that. And also we shall talk a little bit broader about what to do, how to assure that sanctions are implemented in the most effective ways, that there are no loopholes and evasions of sanctions and so on and so on. So that is a topic, and really my pleasure and honor to announce that we shall have brilliant experts of those topics, and with a lot of interest we shall listen, and then we shall see what next we can do, both in the Parliament, in the European Parliament, and in other European institutions. And without long introduction, the last logistical comment, everybody who wants to raise a question or to put a comment should do it on chat, and then shall try to answer. Now we shall have presentation of all the, we have five experts. We shall have all the presentation from them. And after that, I hope that we shall have still time for Q&A. So the first speaker will be Lauri Milverata, lead analyst, Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. So please, Lauri takes the floor, and then the next one will be Olena Pavlenko.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kobilius, and thank you everyone who's joining. I will be presenting a short overview of how the recent crude oil and oil products measures have affected Russia's revenue as a basis for discussion about what can we do next. The good news is that the measures are having an impact. EU's imports obviously have fallen to a small fraction of what they were before Russia's invasion and what they were before December, and Russia's total export revenues have fallen as well. We estimate that currently the bans and price caps are costing Russia about 220 million euros per day, and so for all those of you who've worked on these measures, it's something to take to heart that it's had an impact. There's a lot of confusing reporting about this. There's a lot of uncertainty about the details of the impact, how are shipments taking place, and so on. But looking at the big picture, I don't think there's any question that it's having an impact on Russia's fiscal situation and economic situation. Reported tax revenue is down from December's exports. The current account surplus is down. The latest survey of business climate in Russia's oil and gas sector showed a significant drop. And also the recent announcement of an oil output cut shows that Russia is not happy with the prices and the demand that they're seeing. But still, Russia is making about 150 million euros per day from fossil fuel exports. That's similar to what they were making before the invasion and before fossil fuel prices shot up dramatically. As Olena will illuminate further, their overall fiscal situation is much worse. So it's not in that sense, it's not like Russia is doing just as well as before the invasion, but simply in terms of fossil fuels, there's still a long way to go. So here's our estimate of what the measures have accomplished so far. You can see the breakdown of the 220 million euros changes in prices and volumes. What I want to highlight here is the next steps, the further measures that can be taken. So lowering the price cap to a level that is much closer to Russia's production costs could cut off another 100 million euros or more of Russia's revenues, and banning the remaining imports of fossil gas through pipelines as LNG and remaining oil could cut off another 100 million euros. So those are the obvious steps to take. The thing that we really need to think about, what are we going to do about it, is Russia is still making more than 200 million euros per day, looking at this year so far, from fossil fuels that are being carried by the European shipping industry. So we have a long way to go, whether that's by revising down the price cap or other measures. It's clear that that we can't allow the use of this industry to this degree for the Russian invader. Simply in terms of production costs in Russia, the number to really keep in mind is for every barrel of oil exported from Russia, the producer keeps about $15. The rest goes to Kremlin. So at $60 per barrel, there's still a lot of room for Kremlin to extract tax and to use that to fund the war and the killing. So the $15 is based on the taxation in 2021. The reported tax revenue and selling prices. Another issue that I want to highlight is that it's still perfectly legal for third countries to import Russian crude oil, refine it into oil products, and then export those into the EU. We've identified 6 countries that are acting as refining hubs from which products are going to the EU, to the US, and so on: China, India, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, and Egypt. The total value of oil products imports from these countries to Ukraine's allies has been 13 billion euros in the past 6 months. So this is another area to act on. Based on this, the policy recommendations that I'd like to make, and I know colleagues will discuss this a lot further. Most importantly, revise down the price cap to a level that is much closer to the production costs in Russia. Ban oil products imports and apply price caps to refineries in third countries that take Russian crude oil. Strengthen the disclosure, the enforcement of the price caps, most obviously by increasing the penalties for tankers that violate the cap. Introduce additional measures to limit the buildup of the so-called dark fleet or dark tankers, so transfer of European-owned tankers to shady third parties, and put in place price caps and/or import restrictions on the remaining imports of fossil fuels from Russia into the EU. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Laura. Now we shall switch immediately to Olena Pavlenko from Dixie Group. But before that, two announcements. One is that really our seminar is very important because I see that the chat was attacked by some perhaps Kremlin bots. So that is not so often happens, but yeah, we are trying to keep control. And second, I hope that really very interesting presentations that we shall be able to share presentation after the meeting with after our seminar with everybody on U4U website and other using other possibilities. So and now Olena Pavlenko from Dixie Group on the impact of the sanctions on Russian economy. Please, Olena.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kobilius. And I hope Kremlin bots will have a chance to listen finally the truth what's happening with their economy now. So the year 2022 was very profitable for Russia, and the year 2023 will be very financially problematic for it. In 2022, Russia applied a special formula to all countries that bought its oil and gas, and I call it minus volume plus price. Russia reduced the volume of supply, and with this, it's stimulated the prices at the international markets. And at the end, this allowed Russia with less volumes of gas supply to receive their record profits. Supplying at 80 BCM, billion cubic meters less of gas in 2021, Russia received twice as many funds. But in 2023, the trend may be the opposite. Revenues from gas sales may 2 times, but decrease. The Russian formula minus volume plus price worked only until the fall of 2022. But when it became clear that the European countries were able to get through the winter period and find substitutes for Russian gas, prices began to fall. The price of gas has already fallen to 600 euros per 1,000 cubic meters in comparison to 2,000, which we had in 2022. We see the same trend in the oil sector. And when Russia tried to apply its minus volume plus price formula to the oil market just recently, it didn't work. And Russian government announced that it will cut oil production by 500,000 barrels per day starting in March. And the market hardly reacted to this statement. So here would be my first message to all of you. The Russian formula minus volume plus price no longer works. And even if it does have an effect, it will be much weaker this year than in 2001, 2002. This means that the EU and G7 can continue to reduce price caps for Russian oil and not be afraid of the shock which happened at the beginning of last year. Further reduction of price caps will be much more painful for Russian economy. And if the EU wants to end the war as soon as possible, then the reduction of price caps must continue. Back in the fall of 2022, Russian government officials claimed that Russia was coping with the sanctions normally and they were not affecting it. But this was even repeated by many European experts and journalists. But even then, by indirect sides, it was clear that this was not the case. For example, in autumn, the government obliged Gazprom to pay a special tax of 417 billion rubles per month to cover the growing budget deficit. And this was before oil price caps began to operate. After price caps started to work, the effect of the sanctions became clearly visible. In January 2023, Lauri already mentioned that the budget deficit amounted to $25 billion, which is around 60% of the annual budget deficit. Tax revenues from the sale of oil and gas fell by 46% compared to the same period in 2022, and non-energy revenues also decreased by more than 20%. As again, Lauri mentioned, this is due to the worsening of the business conditions and environment in Russia. Also, expenses increased significantly by almost 60%. It's obvious Russia finances the war, and that requires a lot of money. Now consider that Russia formed this budget at a price of oil of $70 per barrel, while it traded in January around $50. That is, if we take into account the results of the first month, the lower price of oil than expected, and add the results of sanctions on oil products, it is already clear that Russia will end 2023 with a huge gap that will exceed official forecasts. Experts say that the deficit is up to $70–80 billion. If this is so, then probably the liquid part of the National Welfare Fund, which is known as an additional source of money, it will be enough to close this gap, but for not more. It is so the welfare fund is $155 billion, but part of the funds are in investments in assets. Some part also is frozen. So therefore, in fact, if the sanctions pressure continues, Russia's reserves may be enough for a year or maybe a little bit more. And here comes my second message. Since oil and gas sanctions significantly affect the income of Russian budget, this tool should be used in the future. The introduction of price caps for oil products from February 2023 will have an additional effect and will make the revenues to the Russian budget even smaller. And the EU and G7 countries can help Ukraine to end the war already this year if the sanctions continue to apply and intensify. So Russia may simply run out of money by the end of 2023. But along with the decline in revenues from oil and pipeline gas, Russia is doing quite well in other sectors, in nuclear energy and in LNG supply sector. Public data show that revenues from the sale of nuclear fuel and nuclear technologies have increased by 20% in 2022, and many EU countries, in particular Hungary, very much defend the right to cooperate with Russia in the nuclear sector. The situation with LNG is very similar. Exports also increased by 20%, and large part of it supplies to the European Union. So my third message would be there remain sectors where Russia continues to receive income from trade with the EU, and for future sanctions should also apply to these sectors. It is obvious that the Russian budget primarily finances the war and supporting trade in order to invest money in the Russian budget and then further support the war is not only illogical, but also does not correspond to the EU position in support of Ukraine. Therefore, we expect that soon both the LNG and nuclear sectors will also become the EU sanction sectors. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Elena. And now we're moving to May Rosner, Global Witness on price cap enforcement and challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Kobilius, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to talk a bit about reporting and enforcement as it pertains to the price cap. So right now, the system, the way that it's set up is so that companies in the supply chain of Russian oil, of the Russian oil trade, are able to report to each other the price that they're paying for Russian oil cargoes. And the system is set up as one of self-reporting. So these companies are entrusted to mark their own homework, so to speak, and to communicate with each other the price that they're paying for Russian oil and to assure each other that the price is either at the price cap or below. And the problem with this system, when you think about it, is that in most circumstances, when rules are established for responsible business, companies need to demonstrate to a public body or to demonstrate their compliance. And this system is kind of more of a trust system where the compliance is not being monitored or enforced properly by governments. And so there's a system that is very susceptible to fraud and also to, not have high compliance because there's not high levels of enforcement. And when we think about who some of these actors are in the supply chain, for example, we've been looking at Global Witness into one particular Swiss trader that's trading almost a quarter of all of one particular blend of Russian oil called ESPO. And, you know, this is a small company that was set up only a few years ago and whose owners have links to Gennady Timchenko, who is one of Putin's closest allies and who's a sanctioned oligarch. And this is the kind of group that we're entrusting to just kind of abide by the price cap and promise everyone that they're, you know, that they're paying the right price. And so really what we need is much greater oversight and enforcement from government bodies. At the moment, it doesn't seem like anyone is really watching. So I contacted OFAC in the US, and they responded to me that they don't collect attestations. So they have not at this point yet seen an attestation from a tier 1, 2, or 3 operator. I also contacted the UK Treasury, and they let me know that they have collected 0 attestations from tier 1 operators. So these are the traders who are most proximate to the price and know the best what's being paid. And they've only collected, as of February 15th, so 2 days ago, 5 attestations from tier 2 or 3 operators. So those are insurers or shippers or charterers. And at the European level, the picture is even worse because Europe delegates authority over sanctions enforcement to each member state. And it is left to each member state to determine whether or not circumvention of the price cap is happening and to whether or not they want to investigate it. And we know that, you know, between the 27 member states, there's different political will and resources available to investigate these kinds of issues and to properly enforce them. And so you have a country like Greece, which has like an enormous role to play in the shipping of Russian oil. And yet, you know, the Greek authority, when I've been trying to contact them, has also not been, you know, particularly forthcoming in terms of how they're enforcing the price cap and how many of these attestations they're collecting. So there's kind of an issue around transparency. And it would be a real shame if all of these rules that, you know, took a long time to get agreed upon, if the downfall was just that nobody was around to enforce them. You know, these systems were all set up, and it's important now that we make the extra effort to ensure that reporting is happening in a transparent way and that it is regularly subject to audit and review. Thank you.
Thanks a lot again. Really very interesting. And now we are moving to Oleg Savitsky from Razom We Stand and role of authorities in the price cap enforcement and proposition. So Oleg, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Kobilius. Yeah, so building on what May said, some major changes in the policies that are in place are needed, and not waiting for the adoption of new EU directive, which is set to criminalize violation of sanctions. National governments should already start taking very specific steps to enable necessary level of enforcement of energy sanctions, and in particular they should establish or assign dedicated bodies tasked with oversight, control and enforcement of sanctions regime, because only few EU member states have that in place. We have a positive example of Spain doing the homework and tracking the Russian oil through several ship-to-ship transfers and in attempt to breach the embargo to ship Russian oil to European ports through several stages of ship-to-ship transfers. All governments should be doing that. The biggest laggard in that is Greece. Greece basically doesn't do any enforcement, and something should be done with that, maybe on the European Commission level, or the influence from the other member states, or some mechanisms to influence Greek government, so that they really start to follow their extensive shipping industry, because Greek ships they continue to serve a lot of Russian oil and oil product shipments. This is the one thing that national governments should be really tasking special bodies with this, and this involves like special capacities, like doing the analysis and collecting data. Also, just instead of relying on the attestations and the self-reporting, as explained, the authorities should be collecting copies of sales contracts, or require the payments to be processed through authorized intermediaries that can be that can provide verification that the payment is is done below the price cap. There should be like financial control over the trade if this trade continues. But our position as Ukrainian civil society is that trade of Russian oil should be stopped. Basically, we demand a full embargo because we've seen that embargo has big impact. Every time the EU was enacting embargoes, it has major effect on Russian revenues, but those effects were all temporary, because the volumes of supplies were shifting to other markets. And if we are talking about the embargo, in the sense that embargo was applied to other terrorist states and autocratic regimes like Iran and North Korea, then in the case of Russia, the threat is more acute, and the level of sanctions should be higher even than Iran and North Korea and Venezuela and others. But we see the opposite, and embargo is very weak and not enforced. Additional measures are needed, and also there should be not just journalists and civil society organizations tracking Russian oil and investigating possible violations or breaches, but that should be a task of dedicated authorities and law enforcement of countries, of European countries and other countries that are members of the sanctions coalition. And there should be higher punishments for those tankers that are violating the sanctions regime. They should be permanently banned from entry of ports in Europe and elsewhere. And they should be permanently banned from navigating into territorial waters, and also insurance. All the insurance for Russian fossil fuel trade should be withheld. That's basically on the what we see as necessary. And also I would like to highlight that it's not just the trade that continues in the fossil fuels themselves, but also the provision of services that enable Russian fossil fuel industry to operate further. Technology, construction services is still ongoing, and for example, French company is still involved in building LNG ships for Russia, which is unacceptable, and all those contracts should be terminated, and contracts associated with Arctic LNG 2 terminal, everything that is related to that should be terminated in all EU member states, in the US, and all the countries that support Ukraine.
Great. So thanks a lot, Oleg. And now we're moving to Craig Kennedy, David Center, Harvard, on strengthening vulnerabilities in the price cap attestation and compliance system.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kobilius. I'd like to tell you a bit about a case study today that supports the points that Mai and Oleg were making about compliance around the price cap. The price cap, of course, is there to prevent Russia not from being able to ship its oil. It's able to ship its oil using EU G7 tankers and resources, so long as it doesn't earn excessive profits for oil that's trading above the price cap. And of course, as we look across the Russian oil sector today, most of Russian oil and oil products are trading below the price caps that have been set. And so Russia has the legal right to use Western transportation shipping services. And this includes not only tankers which are owned by EU or G7 entities, but also financed and insured by them as well. And the insurance part is an important part because almost 95% of the world's global tanker fleet is insured for spill liability insurance by EU G7 insurance groups. And this is very sticky insurance. It's insurance that's hard to find elsewhere because you have to insure your vessel, your tanker, for $1 billion each tanker. And there's only really one big group, and it's centered in Europe, that can provide that type of insurance. So if we look around Russia today, there is one flow of oil going out of Russia that is actually trading regularly or quoted regularly above the $60 price cap. And that's a grade called ESPO, and it comes out of Russia's Pacific port at Kozmino. And most of this goes to China. It represents a little less than 15% of all of Russia's oil going by sea, but it's a very important flow of oil since it goes to Russia's important client or customer, China, and it's also selling at a very high price right now, so it's a very lucrative flow. So going up into the beginning of December, Russia was moving more and more vessels to the Pacific that would be able to carry this oil without being subject to EU sanctions. And these are vessels that either belong directly to Russia, so they're part of the Sovcom float fleet, and these are both owned by Russia and they're insured by the Russian central bank. And so they're not subject to sanctions at all. Or they're the so-called shadow fleet tankers. And these are tankers, the small number of tankers globally that actually don't use European insurance and aren't owned by EU or G7 entities. So we saw more and more of these vessels moving to the Pacific in anticipation of lifting oil out of Kozmino without having to cut back on supplies and rely on European tankers. But then a strange thing happened. at the beginning of December, suddenly exports out of Kozmino dropped sharply, and only about 60% of them were being supported by Russian ships. And that's because the tankers that had been participating and came from the EU and the G7 or insured by those companies no longer were willing to lift the oil out of Kozmino because they were afraid that they might be in violation of the price cap, since the oil there was trading at $80, $75, $80. And so for a number of weeks, there wasn't enough oil coming out of Kozmino to supply what Russia would normally supply. But then another curious thing happened, and that is the vessels that are insured or owned by the EU and the G7 slowly started to come back and began lifting oil once more. And so by the end of January, we saw flows restored completely from Kozmino. And half of the oil being shipped out was going on tankers that are either owned by EU entities or insured by EU entities. And so the question, the mystery, if you will, of Kozmino is, how is this possible when ESPO is trading, the grade of oil that goes out of there is trading at $75 or $80? And of course, it comes down to the question of pricing information and attestations. As May was discussing earlier, if you are a European-owned or insured tanker and you're receiving oil, you have to get from the trader who's managing that oil confirmation that that oil is priced at $60 or below. And we expect that the shippers have all been receiving these attestations, these confirmations. It's not the original contract, it's just a statement from the traders saying, it's okay, this oil is priced at $60 or below. But the issue with this, of course, is how reliable is that trader? Will that trader provide you with truthful information, or are they incentivized to understate the value of the cargo? And we've seen a big change over the last 12 months in the people who are trading Russian oil. It used to be that there are quite a number of European traders involved, and these would be the trading arms of oil companies or major commodity brokers or banks, but they've all gone away for the most part now. And it is this new group of players, or players that are small and used to be marginal, or traders who are linked to Russian oil companies themselves that are actually providing this information to us. And so it's a real concern that this information might not be valid. This was an issue that was known at the time that the policymakers were creating the price cap. There's even a diagram that the US Treasury put out about the risk of having a bad faith trader provide fraudulent information about the trade. And shippers were warned that they should be looking out for certain red flags and not do business with traders who might provide questionable information. The rules, of course, also state in the sanctions legislation that there are enforcement agencies such as OFAC in the US and OFSI, who, if there are suspicious trades, should demand the attestations from the shippers and review them and see whether or not they look proper and whether the traders who are providing them are reliable actors. And so when we look at what's happening at Kozmino today, we're actually seeing suspicious trades going on. We have some documentation, as Mai was referring to, that show that some of the traders that are involved in this are not necessarily reliable actors. And also some other information that suggests that, in fact, the underlying document or the underlying trades might actually be priced well above $60. And so we need to ask for the enforcement agencies to take a look at the attestations. And if there are issues, close these loopholes. There are several ways to do it. Oleg mentioned some of them. We can put more reliable intermediaries in place. We can put in place a payment authority of some sort through which all of these payments would need to be channeled, and who would be looking at or providing more accurate pricing information. It is a vulnerability. It would require some structuring, but if oil prices around Russia go up, and there's a good chance they will this year as Chinese demand comes back, and we start seeing the Urals price, for example, or diesel prices all trading regularly above the price cap, there's a risk that this vulnerability could affect all of Russia's exports, and that Russia could be, in fact, using Western shipping services for a very large part of its exports, and at the same time earning revenues well above what they should be earning. I just want to say a final word about Russia's ability to ship oil on its own. I'm sure you've all been reading the press, and you've seen all sorts of claims about how large the shadow fleet in Russia is today. But if you actually look at the shipping data out of Russia and the insurance coverage of the ships coming out of Russia, some 70% of the vessels that are lifting oil and oil products out of Russia today are in fact either owned or insured by EU and G7 entities. Russia has a huge need for shipping capacity, as it has to take its oil farther and farther away. And it's still heavily reliant on our services, our shipping services. And so policymakers have a lot of leverage over Russia. Russia will be relying greatly on our services, and we have to make certain that if they do, that the price cap is adhered to. And that's going to require some closer scrutiny of the compliance process. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. And so now we're moving to the last presentation. Tinatin Tsertsvadze, Senior Policy Analyst from Open Society Europe and Central Asia, on sanctions, evasion, and solutions. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kobilius, and I'm joining colleagues also to thank you for organizing this discussion this morning. I have a difficult task to speak after so many good speakers, but what I'll try to do is to zoom out a little bit, broader sanctions issues, and then zoom in the issues of evasion we are facing and provide some recommendations to complement what already has been said in terms of what needs to be done next. Now, to zoom out, I think it's very important, given what has been said already by others, to bear in mind that we are in the long game with sanctions. Sanctions have never been a quick fix. And with everything that we have heard this morning, this is going to be a long game. And there has never been any illusion in Brussels, Washington, or London that sanctions that have been imposed against Russia would provide very quick fixes. Because it's a long game, enforcement of sanctions and proper implementation is further more important. Next, I want to remind all of us when we discuss sanctions, what are the objectives of these particular sanctions, and it is related to in what kind of long game we are. And to me, there are two very clear objectives of these sanctions against Russia. First one is a solidarity towards Ukraine, solidarity from the European Union, but also unprecedented solidarity and coordination across transatlantic and G7 countries. And the second very important objective is to deprive Russia financial means to wage this war. And this is what today's discussion is partly about. These sanctions are unprecedented in many ways, by the speed, by the volume, by the size of Russian economy, but also by the way they were imposed. We have never seen before sanctions coordinated on EU-US level. We have never seen EU's leadership before, and I think it is worth to acknowledge this. We have seen in the past in the situations similar to this, even though we don't have many to compare, UN-led sanctions or primarily US-led sanctions. So I think it's important to acknowledge the leading role EU has taken in developing the 9th or 10th round of sanctions. Now, moving to what are the problems we are facing in the enforcement. Sanctions evasion has been part of the reality of sanctions for as long as sanctions have been used. And sadly, it has not become part of the debate, neither it has received a sufficient political policy attention till now, and this is why we are where we are. There are three important factors to take into account when we talk about sanctions enforcement or evasion. The first is that EU sanctions suffers from the absence of the hard power. It was alluded to by a number of participants here, where what I mean is that there is an absence of the centralized oversight mechanism, which is equipped with powers to penalize those who violate EU sanctions. We face here a twofold problem. One is that EU sanctions are adopted at the European level, but implemented by the national governments. And with 27 national governments, we deal with multiplicity of the enforcement bodies. And this poses a major difficulties for the proper implementation of the EU sanctions. Another problem here on the oversight is that there are actors which are beyond EU borders, and EU sanctions doesn't have authority to be implemented outside of its jurisdiction. EU doesn't have equivalent of OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control in the US, or OFSI that UK has created. And EU doesn't apply sanctions extraterritorially. It considers this against international law, but in current situation, we see how big problem this has created for the proper implementation when it comes to cooperation with third parties. Second important thing is that there are many documented cases that sanctions like this facilitates formation of the shadow trade between the sanctioned states and third actors. The result of this is that trade which was regulated and transparent before could move to the gray zone, and sometimes it can fuel the criminal networks. This is not new. This has happened in the case of Zimbabwe in the past, in the case of former Yugoslavia states, and the sanctions that were imposed there. And this could be something we are witnessing slowly on the Russian oil trade when it is moving outside of the transparent trade and it's moving in the shadow economic zone. It is something to be watched, and it is part of the sanctions. And third factor here are the external determinants, right? Sanctions don't exist in vacuum. They are enforced in a certain regional and global settings. Therefore, the sustainability of the results of the oil embargo, for example, on Russia, goes beyond how strong unity is, how strong US economy is, how strong G7 consensus is. We know that there are third parties, third actors that are very willing to give a helping hand to sanctioned states. We have seen this in the case of Syria. We have seen this in the case most relatively, for example, for this situation on Iran. When oil embargo was imposed on Iran, India and China have given helping hand to Iran to circumvent immediate impacts of the oil embargo on Iran, initially in 2012 in the short term, but not in the long run. And one important factor I would like to underline here in the context of Russia is the sovereign assets. We very often talk about the 300 billion that's frozen across G7, but we hardly ever talk about those assets which are not in the euro or US dominated accounts and which Russia still has access to, which it has provided Russia sufficient cushion to weather the impact of the sanctions in the first year. These are for the immediate result, and I want to come back here to the initial point I made that we're in a long haul and we have to be resilient. EU has to be resilient in implementing these sanctions. Now, moving next to what has been done, given all these shortcomings in EU sanctions, there has been a number of steps taken by the EU, and we have to acknowledge that. The first one is within the existing regulation, it's regulation 388/2014. There is an obligation for member states to adopt rules on penalties, including as appropriate criminal penalties for infringement of the sanctions. And this was included in a regulation prior to before EU will adopt the relevant directive, which is under discussion at the moment. EU also created freeze and seize task force, which is primarily working on the individual sanctions, but the creation of this task force and its close coordination with the REPO task force is very important overall when we talk about sanctions enforcement and implementation. EU also created a special envoy for sanctions implementation. He was put in the position just recently. And the primary task of this post will be to work with third countries on circumvention and evasion, particularly in Gulf states, in Gulf and in Turkey. EU has a very important tool, which is not very well known yet. It's called EU Whistleblower Tool. It's a platform where sanctions evasion cases can be submitted anonymously or not, depending on the applicant. and then Commission takes investigates it and refers to relevant member states. And there are ongoing discussions on the directive to criminalize EU sanctions violations. This directive, however, has a limitation. It applies only on it will apply only on the EU territory. Now, what else can be done? And I have 3 concrete recommendations in addition to what has been said. I think number one, there has to be very serious commitment from the EU that serious allegations or substantial risk of sanctions information and evasion should be investigated. And even though whenever the initial evasion in this happens outside of the EU borders, eventually these products come on the EU borders and enters EU markets. So here the detection of these patterns are very, very important, and proper communication about this is very important. Second important thing is that we don't have very, very full picture about the patterns of evasion. We know some patterns of evasion, some schemes, but there's still a big gap in our knowledge and understanding how this happens. And this is not something we will understand once and this will be job done. This is an evolving schemes. Once the EU managed to crack down on one scheme, new scheme will emerge. So here, very important is to beef up relevant authorities which go after these schemes and to constantly keep on tracking how these schemes emerge, what are the networks, and to crack down on them. And the third and last recommendation is that enforcement, what Mai was referring to. We know that the EU financial sector was very well prepared for this type of sanctions because financial sector was enforcing sanctions prior to that, because there are other regulations, anti-money laundering regulation, for example, which oblige its financial sector and operators to be very vigilant on potential suspicious transactions. Oil embargo and especially the price cap is a very new phenomenon for the EU to implement, and regulators are not used to, and they don't know what to do with that. And here is a very, very speed learning process to be done to make sure that attestations are done properly, that information is shared properly, and an oversight is done as it is done. Probably we can learn a lot from the financial sector here. I'll leave it at there and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, good. So thanks a lot. Really very interesting, very, very inspiring to look for new steps, what we need to do, you know. Really, I would be very happy if you would, I don't know how you are united, in which kind of team, you know, if you would make some kind of, you know, paper for us to have all those different aspects, you know, in one place, that would be great. Now, yeah, chat is not very active, but we have one question from our good friend from France, member of Senate, very active member of our United for Ukraine network, parliamentary network, Andrei Katolin. And he has a very specific question. I quote, "I am very interested in having more information on French tech companies providing chips to Russian oil companies." I don't know who has, you know, from you, you know, do you have any kind of this specific information? Or if you are able to provide us that information, then we shall send it, you know, to Andrea, or you should, you know, have some kind of contact with him. I don't know who can comment that, you know, question.
Yeah, I can comment on that. Basically, it's about the provision of LNG tanker technology by a French company called Gas Transport and Gas Technique, GTT it's called, and they announced that they are exiting Russia, but they are really not, and they are still involved in construction of 4 huge LNG tankers in a Russian shipyard. So this is a big problem that the European company is still involved in Russian expansion of fossil fuel export capacities. Okay. Yeah, I will add. There was a recent article by Huffington Post on this, and I will share.
Okay, and now I see, I saw Craig Kennedy wants to add something. Please go on.
Yes, this goes a bit broader than chips as such, but I think it's an important point to make. Up to now, we've been very focused on Russian exports, and we haven't actually done much in terms of upstream Russian oil field technology sanctions. There were sanctions back in 2014 that affected Arctic drilling, that affected special types of shale drilling. But these are actually very marginal. 95% of Russia's oil comes from traditional oil fields. And the technology around that conventional oil extraction has not been sanctioned up until now. Russia has a very large production base. It's very old, and many of the wells are very inefficient. And in order to maintain economic flows of oil from those wells, they rely intensively on imported technology. And it's not just equipment like drills and drill bits, but it's also very sophisticated technology for seeing down 3 kilometers into the earth to understand how the liquids are flowing and where to drill and where to inject water to create more pressure. These are highly sophisticated software packages. These are packages which are designed and provided by Western companies, and that Russia relies on heavily to make certain that it can keep its production levels inexpensive. It's not so much a question of producing enough, it's producing it cheaply. And so I think one of the things that policymakers should be focusing going forward is, should we be looking more closely at the technology that's being provided to help manage Russia's upstream oil production, and specifically the software? Is it still being provided? And if so, is that proper?
Okay, and yeah, and I see Lauri. Yeah, please go on.
Thank you. Going back to the LNG ships, I just wanted to highlight that currently Russia clearly doesn't have enough LNG tankers to move the LNG out of Russia. So half of the shipments are carried out using tankers with EU ownership or European insurance. So if we manage to prevent Russia from accessing new tankers and impose restrictions on those, that would put a lot of pressure, especially on the Arctic LNG projects, and prevent them from exporting at full capacity.
Okay, and I see, yeah, Oleg wrote, those who are interested to have a link to publication on French company. So Oleg put the link, and also he's saying that Samsung Heavy Industries is also involved in building tanker for Russia. So that is an information. And Andrei, if you will need some additional information, of course, we can link you to Oleg or to others who are here participating. Now we have another question from Daria Malink, and the question is, how can EU countries block the international projects of Rosatom? So just everybody knows that EU failed to put Rosatom into 10th package. Also, we had a conversation with some experts, and follow our webinars. We are planning to have special webinar on Rosatom with some experts, but maybe somebody wants to react now from this panel. Okay, Olena, yeah, please.
Yes, happy to take this question. Maybe I will divide the answer into two. First is the EU countries, which still work with Russia in nuclear sphere. And here we have to talk that these countries should definitely switch from Russian fuel to some other resources. And Ukraine has a great experience when we switched from Russian fuel to Westinghouse fuel. So It is possible, and this is the question of will of each country, whether it wants or does not want to continue work with Rosatom in this sector. Regarding international projects, this is the second part of my answer. We do have a list of propositions what to do with Rosatom and with all Russian nuclear sector, because it is very much true that it might, in few years, it might be a more serious problem than a gas issues. Because if Russian Rosatom builds nuclear power plants in African countries, in Latin American countries, and also in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they have negotiations now about building nuclear power plants there. It means that these countries will be dependent from from this nuclear power plants generation, electricity generation. And there might be the similar problem, similar situation, which we have now in Ukraine with Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, yes? You have Russians there, they blackmail the country, they even say that they can blow the nuclear power plant if something happens. The similar situations, the similar threats might happen to every country where Russians will build their nuclear power plants, because they will also operate this nuclear power plants. And here, what could be done? First, we propose to remove Russia and Rosatom and all related companies from the governing bodies of EAAA, the coalition, the organization which is responsible for the nuclear security issues. The goal or the aim is to show that nobody will be responsible for the security and the high level work which Russia will provide in building some nuclear power plants or sharing some technologies. So everybody, every country should fear, should be afraid to work with Russia, because nobody will guarantee that this work is safe and well built. Second, we do propose to encourage all companies which work in energy sphere, within electricity sector, in energy sector, not to work with those countries, with those companies who work with Rosatom or who want to develop the nuclear projects in the countries. It also make those countries, those third countries, think whether they want or do not want to, to victimize or to suffer from not working with Western companies, with high-level, well-developed companies from Europe and the US and G7 countries, and just stick to Russian technologies and Russian nuclear fuel. I think this kind of encouragement or pressure would be a good start. And definitely for every country where Russia has negotiations to build some new nuclear technologies, we can develop very specific propositions and ideas. We do have some already ideas there. Thanks. Mr. Kobilius, you are muted.
Myself, and just to read one comment. Yeah, comment from Mark Demesmaker, Belgium senator, whom again, very active member of our network. And the comment on exactly on nuclear imports and cooperation with Rosatom. Mark is saying financial impact of an embargo on nuclear fuels would be tiny compared to the impact of sanctions on oil and gas. But Rosatom is also supplying Russian arms industry and thus supporting Kremlin assault on Ukraine. That makes it urgent. So this is a comment, perhaps does not require any additional, discussion about that. But as I said, we are planning to have special seminar on sanctions on Rosatom. Now, I have several, questions on the topics which we were discussing, and maybe I will put them first of all, starting from just request. For me, it looks very important really to have numbers, which you presented on sanction impact. And really, I saw a brilliant presentation of Lori, but but here was, a deficit of Olena numbers. So I don't know how to ask Olena, especially that, conclusion that sanctions on oil and gas can bring Russian, reserves, financial reserves, to the end during this year. So why I'm saying, because really we need also to do this, how to say, strategic communication work to convince Western politicians that really it's really bringing an impact on Russian financial situation, also sanctions, and we need to continue. So if Olena can add whatever in written or some kind of graphic, of your forecast, that would be great. Now, my second point on compliance, and I was, perhaps we were talking that, but again, I am asking to know additional, additional idea, which, I don't know if that's possible to implement, but very simple point. Quite recently in Parliament, we were discussing and hot debates were on so-called taxonomy, which is, an instrument, to measure or to inspect are the industries following, requests to be climate neutral, and to cut CO2 emissions. And, and the whole idea is that, the banks, financial institutions are looking, using that instrument to see if they can, give credits to those, industries, because they are demanding that the industry should comply with requests on, compliance on, climate neutrality. So my question is, are we able to move also and to raise a question at least, to consider, sanctions against such a regime like Kremlin, in some way similar like sanctions on violation of climate neutrality. So and in that case to try to construct an instrument which would be useful for especially for financial institutions, and and to in some way to show the perspective that those business companies or service companies which were violating violating sanction regime will not only be punished by some criminal punishment which EU is considering, but also their access to financial institutions could be also very much restricted. So I don't know if that's possible to do. I'm not an expert on all those issues, but I see some parallel in what is done with CO2 emissions. That could be done the same with evasion of sanctions. I see. Craig, can you elaborate on that?
Thank you. It's a very interesting idea. And as you know, I think you're in part referring to the global portfolio industry. These are the very large investors like pension funds and other investment funds that have now put in place a certain set of criteria, usually referred to as ESG, which refers to environmental, social, and governance. And there's a good case to be made that the governance part should include oil that's provided by sanctioned entities, such as Russia. So I think you could campaign among fund managers in some of the major financial centers to begin asking large corporations about their involvement with Russia in the oil sector. And begin marking them down on their ESG scorecards when it comes to their exposure to the Russian oil industry, either as a service provider to it or as somebody who's using Russian oil or oil products as a major input to their businesses. So I think there's a good case to be made for that as well. And I think in terms of specific Actually, I'll pause on that, but I'd like to come back to your first question about providing specific numbers to support some of the statements that we were making earlier. But I think others may want to comment on the second question that you asked, Mr. Kobilius.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, yeah, now my last question, maybe to Tinatin, you know. Quite accidentally, I found on our, Facebook, Lithuanian Facebook, networks, one presentation made by Lithuanian, I think that it's Mr. Žemlys, data expert. He made interesting, investigation of export data after the war started. And if Jonas can put the link to that, you can see. I'm again not a big expert on data, but you should. I see what are the conclusions, and I will read them. Two conclusions: export to Russia after the war from EU dropped by 47%. From February till let's say those days. But export to Russian neighbors increased by 48%. From EU, and those are clear data. And then sanctioned goods, sanctioned goods export to Russia fell by 71%, and sanctioned good export to Russian neighbors increased by 95%. And he's providing several examples how, for example, Poland increased turbojets export to Kazakhstan, Czechia increased smartphones, by big numbers. So I think that those data are really, how to say, they are showing some picture. And my question, what to do with that? You spoke a little bit about that, but I am considering, what practical steps, especially when we're talking about such countries like Kazakhstan, maybe Georgia, maybe some other countries, what can we do?
Thank you very much. A very, very good question. And it's actually yesterday, I believe EBRD published similar data, official data, where it says that there is a huge trade diversion to Caucasus and to Central Asia following imposition of the EU sanctions. They don't specifically say in that report there is a sanctions evasion, but there is such a high number of trade diversion that it doesn't match the size of the economies of these countries. So I think data is very clear there. I will divide those countries that are accession or pre-accession and those that are not in this process, because there are specific things that can be done. Country like Georgia, for example, which has applied for EU membership, hasn't gotten candidate status, but is considered as together with Moldova and Ukraine. For this type of countries, including in Western Balkans and Eastern Partnership countries, there is an obligation to transpose EU acquis. EU sanctions are part of the EU acquis as common foreign security policy. And there are recent studies which show that Georgia's transposition over the last 10 years of the CFSP, these declarations of the EU, are at 50%, while Moldova and Ukraine is at 70%. So here, Georgia has a clear obligation within its DCFTA, within its association agreement, to transpose EU laws in the process of the approximation politically and economically with the EU. Now, EU doesn't have a specific measure by which it can impose this kind of rules on Georgia, but it can certainly politically leverage by scoring its law in the evaluations or by advising it in the dialogue and making the public statements about that. So there's a certain obligation and expectation vis-a-vis Georgia to do more. On Georgia, actually, it's important to look at different sectors. For example, on trade, we don't have a very clear data what kind of trade is happening there, but this is most likely the sector or area where most circumvention is happening on the re-exporting and re-importing. On the financial sector, I must say there's probably less likely because Georgian financial sector, the banking sector, is very well integrated in the European and international financial banking sector. And Bank of Georgia has made a number of statements that They don't make transactions to and from the sanctioned individuals. But if there are outside of the banking sector transaction sanctions, such as the Western Union, for example, it's outside of the control of the banking sector. So there is still something to be done on the financial sector. Now, when we talk about countries which are not in the similar accession process, such as Central Asian countries, Armenia is another country mentioned, their situation is slightly different. There is no moral or political obligation from those, no political obligation. Moral, I would question if there is no moral obligation. So there, I think the only thing you can do is to engage with those countries on a very high diplomatic level. Through its envoy, EU has a special, US special representative for Central Asia, a Finnish diplomat. This position to be used to raise an importance, how important it is that this kind of diversion doesn't happen for the benefit of the Russian economy. Beyond engaging on a political level with Central Asian states, I'm afraid we don't have legal instruments or leverage to the same for Armenia. But it's very important that we engage with them. We engage with them, but we don't discourage or discard in this engagement at the same time the situation that these countries are facing, very severe human rights situations, as you know. So there should be a very, very careful balancing act to be made there, how you engages with this type of countries. And then there are Gulf countries which also participate in this. I leave it there.
Okay, and I see Craig, and that perhaps would be, oh, and Laurie, but I'm looking into my watch. I need to jump very soon to another webinar. So 2 last comments maybe. Okay, Craig, please.
I just want to come back to your first question about numbers that help support our arguments. I'm going to try and share my screen here now. You know what? I'm not certain it's going to work. Hang on. Can you see a map now on my screen?
No, for time being,
okay.
no.
So I'm sorry, I'm having technology trouble this morning. So I do have some data sets and some slides that show how it is that Russia is still highly dependent on Western tankers. And what it shows is that, first of all, because Russian oil is having to travel so much further than it did before, Russia today needs twice as many oil tankers to manage the same amount of exports that it did a year ago. That's point number one. Point number two is that if you look at the size of Russia's own national fleet, and you add it to the number of shadow tankers that are actually active in Russia today, not the ones that somebody thinks might be anchored somewhere off the coast of Aruba waiting for a call from Tehran, but ones that are actually consistently going into Russia and moving oil, and you add those together with Russia's own tankers, it barely covers 30% of Russia's current export needs. The demand for tankers is massive, and we have numbers. We've gone through and scrubbed all the data. And so it's important to make the case to policymakers that the Russian shadow fleet is not able to get around sanctions and move most of Russia's oil. That is, unfortunately, people who, many of them well-informed generally, who are having to answer a new question they've never had to measure before and just haven't gotten it right yet. People will in time, but it's important to get good information out there. And I will provide you with the slides that support this point.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah, Laurie and then Olena is the last one. Okay, Laurie.
On the shadow exports through third countries, I just wanted to say that, first of all, it's important to identify certain highly strategic goods like high technology exports, and for those, besides the engagement that Tika talked about, I would really say that it's time to start going first after entities that act as re-exporters to Russia, start sanctioning those, and with the clear implication that the countries that allow such entities and allow such exports could face consequences as well. But start with the specific entities that are importing from the EU and exporting to Russia.
Okay, good. Olena, please.
Thank you very much. To add to the ideas, what could be done with the shadow exports and shadow trade, I want to give, so it's as an idea, but it's not well developed yet. I just think about this now. If you implement technical projects funded by EU or by the US, you definitely have some elements in your contract or grant agreement which says that you cannot buy or trade with companies which are in a blacklist or terrorist countries or other issues. So I think if it's a case for the technical assistance projects, maybe IFIs and maybe also at the EU level, such elements could be an obligation for the companies who want to trade with Russian neighbors or with other countries or companies which have relations with Russia, to at least make them think that they will violate the contract. And after that, there might be some punishment. So I think it might decrease some level of trade and this shadow export-import operations. But again, the idea is raw. It should be considered more in details. But to discuss for the future. Thanks.
Okay, thanks a lot. So time is closing. And I would like, first of all, to thank all the panelists. Really, it was very interesting, very important, and a lot of thoughts, for the future, what we can do. As I said, we're planning to have a special webinar on Rosatom in a few weeks' time. So please follow our emails. And then information, or let's say, video record of this discussion will be on the Facebook. We shall put it on our U4U website. Also, we shall send links to all the participants, and panelists. Please share, and let's look what we can do, in real terms. What next steps we need to do. So let's keep, in our network, and if the panelists will manage to have some kind of not very long paper, for us, not a big experts on some of those things, it would be very, very valuable. So again, thanks a lot and good luck to everybody, and let's fight for this battle. Let's continue to fight. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.